I see a lot of my media colleagues and pundits opining about whether or not the 2021 Canadian election was necessary or not. It was just a big waste of time. Well, I have a different take on that, and I'm going to talk about it with Dr. Stewart Prest, who's a political scientist at Fraser University. So welcome to the interview, Stewart.
Oh, thanks, Markham.
Look, here's my thesis for what it's worth. The average life of a minority government in Canada is 18 months. This one's been going for 2 years. And I get it that the Liberals still commanded the confidence of the House. There was no non-confidence vote. Work was getting done. Legislation was getting passed. Nevertheless, there are huge crises confronting the country, climate change and COVID-19 and all sorts of other issues. I think it was reasonable for the Prime Minister to call an election, even though we're in the fourth wave of COVID-19, because other provinces, including BC, where you and I live, have had elections during the COVID-19. So that's my take on it. Do you agree or disagree?
Well, in a sense, I think you can make an argument that any time is a good time for an election, if particularly this sort of moment where a prime minister is effectively willing to step into the dock and invite the judgment of the people. Whenever they're willing to do that, there's a potential consequence. It may not go the way that they intend, and so I think that there can always be something that the election is for. I think where this particular election call runs into trouble is that the Liberals themselves, it seemed like, had trouble articulating in a clean sort of way exactly why now. So when Parliament is functioning, and it's not that they had a set of specific things they were trying to achieve that they could not. It just was this general sense of not why have an election, but why not have an election, which on one level is fair. But when you are moving to the polls at a time that was not parliamentarily speaking necessary, then there's, I think, a political imperative to make the case cleanly for why that is. And so if we compare with BC last year, it seems like the BC NDP were able to make the case pretty clearly that a decision needed to be taken about how to move forward through the pandemic, and they were able to draw a contrast with the BC Liberals, and the BC Liberals were not up to the task of countering the NDP at the time. And the federal Liberals tried the same thing and very nearly failed. It seems like they may have righted the ship in terms of how polling is responding now, but they had a rough couple of weeks during the election.
Well, fair enough. And I think that's actually a fair criticism of the Prime Minister and the Liberal team for not doing a good job of explaining why the election was required. But when I look at the election platforms, particularly climate and energy, which is the beat that we cover, I think this is an election about substantive issues. I mean, look at the things that have been put on the table. The Liberals, for instance, have proposed an emissions cap for Canadian oil and gas. This is huge. I can't say that enough. You know, it's 26% of Canadian greenhouse gas emissions. As long as production goes up, emissions always go up, and production will be going up again in the 2020s. There was no way we were ever going to meet our GHG commitments, our climate commitments by 2030, unless oil and gas was wrangled into submission on this issue the government has proposed. And then there's all sorts of other things like, you know, the national electricity grid, which 3 of the 4 parties now have platform planks on. I think this election was about substantive issues were put before the electorate, even if my media colleagues didn't want to talk about them.
And I think there's certainly a fairness to the critique of media. There's also, it seems like at times the different parties have had trouble keeping the focus on some of those substantive issues that are there that are certainly worth attention. I mean, I was making an argument at the beginning of the election that issues like climate would be decisive in this election because there were such strong differences among the different party, both their track records and their respective commitments. So the Liberals, in theory, have a pretty strong advantage on climate relative to parties of both the left and the right, relative to the parties of the right. Mr. O'Toole is clearly taking climate change more seriously than his predecessors, but their plan is not as detailed or as aggressive as the Liberals' plan. And for the NDP have some strong targets, but they remain fuzzy on the details in a way that we have seen parties act previously when they were perhaps not taking the issue seriously. So successive Liberal and conservative governments would put targets in place, but not necessarily have the roadmap there. And the Liberals have this roadmap running through the carbon tax and the additional measures you're describing. They have a certain bona fide quality on climate the other parties don't have. The problem is that quite often the campaign ended up being about different things, and that is partly a function of coverage. It is also partly a function of where the different parties put the attention, whether it's in terms of focusing on other kinds of wedge issues. There was a great deal of time spent on, say, gun control, a great deal of time spent on issues such as abortion access, and these are important issues, but they're also emotionally laden issues. They're designed to create an emotional wedge between parties for voters. And I think where this election has been frustrating for observers like me is that too often we've been focused on, say, wedge issues, or we have seen parties essentially positioning themselves for tactical purposes without that larger discussion really getting the full-throated treatment it deserves.
There's one other issue that has come to the fore in this campaign that has, really taken over a lot of the coverage, and that's the anti-vax protests and the PPC, the Maxime Bernier's incendiary rhetoric. And I mean, at one point he was tweeting about revolution, for goodness sakes. That's not a Canadian thing, for sure. And on the one hand, so I have mixed feelings about this. Like, on the one hand, it's very unfortunate that this has become such a big issue, dominated, and we've seen the PPC rise as a result in polling. So I think that's unfortunate. But then on the other hand, I'm almost glad we've got it out on the table now. I mean, this is, it's like Donald Trump and the MAGA movement has bled across the border. We're always 5 years behind the Americans, it seems. And look at the problems that it caused in American politics and the attacks on democratic institutions and traditions and processes. And it looks like we're in. So I'm glad that we put that on the table. And maybe now we have the opportunity that it is on the table to deal with it. Your take?
I think it has clearly been the dominant background issue, and we have seen at different times the parties try to place more attention on it. And it's interesting that the Liberals were pretty keen to turn it into one of those wedge issues early on, with positioning themselves around a vaccine mandate. And it's very clear it was an issue where Aaron O'Toole really wanted to try to limit the distance between himself and the Liberals, but that came at a certain price, because among the more vaccine skeptic or essentially government action skeptical segments of the population, those who would like to make issues like mask wearing and vaccines purely a matter of personal choice, they're more likely to encounter them on the right of the political spectrum. And so it was a strategic choice by Mr. O'Toole, and it made the race interesting. It sort of created this consensus position among parties that we were going to do quite a lot, not necessarily exactly the same things to respond to COVID, but it left this space open that Maxime Bernier has stepped into, this sort of principled stand. No, this is personal choice, and government's mandating action on something that can threaten the health of thousands of Canadians ought not be subject to government action, and that is an easy to understand perspective, which is out of step with where most Canadians are, but it is, as you say, on the table now, and it is creating some problems for the Conservatives, and it illustrates one of the challenges of having an election right now. It creates a great deal of heat around some of these issues that we were dealing with prior to the election, and it is clearly created something of a polarization within the country. So we see these protests are gaining momentum in some places, and I think it is a reminder that we are a divided country, although not necessarily in a sort of 50-50 way that we see in the United States. We more have a very vocal minority on those issues, and it's something that we're going to have to continue to manage as a polity effectively. How do we take into account objections while also creating a basis that the majority of the country wants to go forward on to try to respond to what is clearly a threat to everyone's health at some level, and some Canadians' health in an extreme way.
Well, fair enough. And I guess to sum up, Stewart, my position is still the same. That I think this was an election that should have been more about substantive issues. Certainly, they were put on the table to discuss. And I'm pushing back against my media colleagues who were saying, shrugging their shoulders. This is an inconsequential election nobody wanted, and it was just a waste of time and money. I don't think that at all. I think this is a really important election, and we failed to discuss those substantive issues the way we should have. Nevertheless, we've got a lot. I think we know after whoever forms government tonight or this week, depending on when the mail-in ballots are counted, I think that they have a full plate ahead of them to put the country back on track and to deal with these particular issues. So anyway, final word to you, sir.
Well, it is an election that will have consequences. So I think that much is clear. There are, as you say, big issues on the table, and they're not going to go away after the election does. And I think there are some of the consequences of having this discussion the way it's unfolded will themselves be felt. The fact that we may have two parties of the right, at least in some parts of the country, is interesting. Something that we're going to have to, I think, watch how it plays out in the months to follow. But we are always the better for having an opportunity to discuss the direction of the country and see if we can't come to some sort of operating consensus about where to go next. And so we've seen that happen. And I hope for those who are disappointed in the direction, the results of this election, and it may be that a number of the major leaders are going to be, that they can reflect on how they could have had that discussion that you're referring to in a different way than it ultimately played out. So we will watch and have a lot to talk about this time tomorrow, I think.
We will indeed. And I look forward to having that conversation. Stewart, always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.